Thank you so much, JB, and welcome everybody. We're so happy that you could join us today. Thank you to Semaphore for hosting us, and thank you, Dr. Gottlieb, for joining. Clearly, this is a topic of conversation that's very relevant, something that we deal with every day with our products. So I just wanted to kind of kick it off and talk a little bit about when it comes to social media, what are some of the things that you'd like to see social media companies or others do to help protect youth from accessing products that they shouldn't be able to see?
Yeah, look, I think when you think about the content and thinking about through the FDA lens, there's the sort of sponsor-generated content, sponsor-generated advertising that may take place on social media. I think there's things that are in the gray area, which is sort of the organic content that sponsors aren't engaged in generating but are involving their products. And then there are things that are clearly, I think we all can agree, over the line where social media sites should be taking a more aggressive role because it's dealing with illegal activity online. With respect to the sponsor-generated content, and obviously some of the context here is tobacco products, by and large, from my standpoint, when we were at FDA, there were certain anecdotes where we knew sponsors were engaging in advertising through social media, where they were promoting their products in ways that, frankly, and now in retrospect, were clearly violative. And it happened on occasion. There were only a handful of those instances. But FDA has a very robust regulatory toolbox to regulate the advertising that sponsors engage in. And I think the best way that the agency can impose those regulations and that oversight is making sure that these products are cleared and approved. And as you know, because of the complexities of the regulatory process and the huge backlog of thousands of applications that the agency has, a lot of these alternative nicotine delivery vehicles and these alternative products have not been approved, cleared by FDA. And I think that limits their ability to step in and impose the oversight that they have within their legal authority. On the things that are clearly over the line, and you and I worked on this when we were at the agency, I'm thinking in particular about some of the opioid advertising that was happening online at the time. And this has gotten a lot better, but back in 2017, 2018, when we first started working on this and you convened the work groups on this, there was a lot of opioids, and these weren't opioids, they were counterfeit products, illegal products being advertised as Vicodin, Percocet, but they were really pressed fentanyl, that you were able to find on the surface web. You didn't need to search very deep to find this advertising, and it was being pushed through a different medium. And we convened some roundtables, got the social media sites to agree to come to FDA, and had a number of open discussions with them about steps that they could take, voluntary steps that they could take to try to reduce some of this activity online. And I think that has clearly improved. It's very hard, and if you type in opioids now online, you get a whole bunch of self-help advertising. I don't think that what the FDA did at the time was the only reason the circumstances improved. But I think it contributed to that, and I think it certainly started the public discussion around what the social media sites could be doing voluntarily to address some of this violative material. And they were fairly motivated to do that. I think it was a question of trying to create a neutral forum where they can have that discussion, and you were able to agree upon sort of a common set of practices and steps that they would all take. And that was very important, doing this in a collective fashion, right, so that you weren't just individually trying to browbeat or impose regulation on individual social media sites. And so I think that was a good model for how you can galvanize action in this space. And that gets to that third category of the organic content, where there's content online that the algorithms are making accessible to the kids, either deliberately or more likely inadvertently, because the kids are influencing their own algorithms, where the sponsors aren't responsible for it. I think by and large, the sponsors don't want it there, particularly in the tobacco realm, because it's both a regulatory and a political liability for them. But it's not so over the line like opioid advertising, where there's really sort of that collective action to try to do something. And there I would just say, when you look at the different social media sites, particularly with respect to the parental controls, and I have young kids, and so I've gone into all these sites and programmed them, there's a lot of things that are being done at an individual site level that I think are highly effective in terms of parental pairing that TikTok's doing, being able to put age controls on some of these sites, and influence the algorithm, being able to report violative things when you see them. I think we could benefit in that realm. I think government regulation would be problematic here because my concern would be that it would create both a floor and a ceiling on what companies would do. And I think there's probably some companies that would like regulation because then they could say, look, we're regulated, this is what we're required to do, this is what we're doing. But I think this is one realm where there's a lot of innovation. Technology is going to be a real tool here, things like AI filtering. But it's hard to access these controls when they do exist. Different sites are doing different things. And I think this is a place where we could benefit from some kind of broader convening. Maybe the FTC becomes the locus of this to try to say, hey, these are the tools that are being used. How can we create a common set of standards? How can we make sure that this is uniformly accessible to parents, that parents are properly educated on it, so you don't have to go to each individual site to do it, and it looks different and feels different. And maybe even think about, and we had this discussion beforehand, ways you can do it at the level of the phone, where when you program a phone, when you go into the iPhone and you set it up for a 14-year-old and put in place parental controls in that phone, can you opt in to have the fact that this is a 14-year-old's phone transmitted to the social media sites so then they know that these controls have been called for, asked for. So I think that there are ways to set up a better uniform architecture, similar to what we did on opioids, where the sites come together and agree to adopt certain common standards.
Well, as you remember, it wasn't easy to get them to the table in the first place.
It was not easy,
So, what is government's role then? Since you took an active role at FDA, where do you think government needs to be, since this is such a conversation in Washington on how to address this problem? What does that look like?
Yeah, what I worry about is that because we're seeing such a patchwork of regulation now, and we've been down this road before, we have states take individual regulatory action in the FDA space, not in this space, but in a lot of other spaces, where the companies then come to you and they say, we want federal standards, because we can't deal with this patchwork of regulation. And I think that we're at a tipping point right now where you could see the social media companies potentially opting for a federal scheme. I still think that the idea of government being a convener, working with multiple stakeholders, including the child safety groups, which I think have better awareness of what's happening online, to create a common set of tools that are accessible to parents. And then it becomes, if you have sort of a common set of tools, it becomes easier to educate parents on that. So it's not sort of a hodgepodge of things. It becomes very hard to access. And I think about, again, in the FDA context, we were never in, and you remember this, we were never in a good position to spot trends and spot social trends. And that's why we got behind the curve on the initial vaping crisis associated with kids' use of vaping products back in 2018. And it certainly was something that was a challenge with respect to opioids. And with respect to opioids, we ultimately created a small team inside FDA whose job it was to actually monitor social media sites, not for purposes of trying to police the content, but to be able to know what was going on, what people were saying. And this is how early on we spotted use of gabapentin in association with opioids, where people who were abusing opioids were using gabapentin in conjunction with the opioids to help potentiate the high that they were getting. And we first identified that by looking at chat rooms and starting to see people talking about this online. But that was a very unique circumstance where I think that we were, I wouldn't say ahead of a trend, but we were able to see a trend as it was emerging. But more often than not, we were behind these things. With respect to vaping, we found out about that. Certainly the National Youth Tobacco Survey back in 2018 identified the trend, but we started to hear anecdotally from school teachers and people who had kids in high schools of what was happening in the high schools, and that was really the first indication. And I say that just to point out that if the government's in the position of trying to regulate the content, which I'm not even sure is permissible, but if they try to take a more affirmative role, I think it's going to be very hard for government to be in a position to identify these things. And I think that's why putting more controls in the hands of parents and stakeholders in the community who have better awareness of what's going on and allowing them to put in place controls that can then filter that content. And certainly technology is going to be a big solution here. And that's, again, why I'm worried about regulation, because it would create both a floor and a ceiling, and it may inadvertently stifle the adoption of technology, things like AI filtering that could take out certain imagery from things that kids are seeing. And government can play a role here also in providing that content when they see it to the social media sites, so they can start to put in place those filters, things that are clearly violative. But by and large, I think the government agencies are going to be very far behind the curve in starting to identify this material.
Right. So what does the private sector or some of these companies, can they do proactively to suggest that they're taking this seriously and want to work with government or other stakeholders on solving this problem?
Yeah, look, again, I think they recognize the vulnerability, and so my perception is that they've been leaning forward to try to tout what they're doing. But to the extent that what they're doing remains a very kind of fragmented universe of different things, and different sites are doing different things. TikTok has in place parental pairing, but Instagram doesn't. I think to the extent that these things become more uniform, it's going to be more accessible to the parents, because they're going to know, these are the 10 tools that are available, and they're kind of available uniformly across the different sites. And I think that there are, obviously it's going to vary from site to site, because what you're looking to achieve and the content you're trying to filter is going to be different if you're a parent trying to intervene to take more control of what your children are seeing. But even setting that aside and allowing for that, I still think that there are common tools that could be used across these platforms in variations, and if the platforms were adopting them in a more uniform standard, then it would be easier, it would be more accessible, and it'd be easier for parents to train themselves on them, and even for kids to have awareness of it and do things like self-reporting of things that they were seeing. We don't really have that right now, and I think that's, again, where the government could play a role.
Okay.
That doesn't, my view is it doesn't require regulation. It doesn't require legislation. I think that could be done through what we tried to do at FDA, which was bring together the stakeholders, come up, and we did come up with a uniform, wasn't a Bill of Rights, what did you call it? I forget what we called it, but it was basically like a white paper that we generated. This was an open public forum. We generated content that, all the sites agreed that they were going to try to do these certain things. And I think that's going on now, but I don't think that there's really as visible and high level of an effort to do that as there could be.
Is there anyone that you think is being left out of this debate or discussion that should be a part of it and needs to be heard?
Well, I mean, we had this discussion, and I think the one group that I think was absent from our discussion, and maybe they're here today, but should be part of the discussion, is some of the child safety groups. I think that they have a lot of awareness of what's going on. They have more proximity to some of the parental organizations. I think they also have the ability to convene stakeholders at a local level. And so, if you kind of have a common toolbox, ultimately you're going to need to get parents educated on how to make use of these tools. And that could be led at a local level, where schools could be leading some of this discussion, trying to incentivize parents and instigate parents to adopt these tools, maybe even requiring it.
Or educate them.
Educate them, but maybe even say at a local school level. You see a lot of schools banning phones in the school, but you could see them just as likely saying, look, if you're going to allow your kid to have a phone in school, you have to do these things to the phone. The other stakeholder, I think that's an important part of this discussion, are the phones themselves, the companies that make the smartphones, because you could, and we had this discussion with one social media site, you could see a realm where the controls are implemented at the level of the phone. So you can go onto an iPhone right now and you can put in place pretty vigorous parental controls on the phone, limit app times, close off certain apps. My children certainly know that you can do this because I've done it. But that information stays on the phone, and to the extent that information can be voluntarily shared with some of these social media sites, that could create a uniform way to step into age verification, for example. So instead of doing the age verification at the level of every site, you could do it on the phone, and the phone could then promulgate that information to the social media sites to say, hey, this is a 14-year-old's phone.
Right.
I think that the phone providers would be very reluctant to allow that information to seep off the phone without, really sort of voluntary steps on the part of the parents. What happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone. But there's no reason that functionality can't be built in. There's actually apps you can download that would provide for that. And I think that that's another potential solution. I think so the people who make the smartphones also need to be part of this discussion.
Yeah, very complicated issue. But great to see that people are actually coming together to have this discussion, make progress. Hopefully throughout the day we see more transparency and willing to work together for a standard of care for everybody to kind of align around going forward. So thank you, Semaphore, again for hosting us, and thank you, Dr. Gottlieb, for joining us.
Thanks a lot.